Welcome, everybody, for our fourth session in the Vaccine Insights Hub Flexible Learning course. Today, we're going to talk about how to monitor conversations on social media. We'll go through some tools and some tricks. Please feel free to follow along as I'm going to be demonstrating some of these tools. Like any tool, these are better the more you use them. It's like riding a bike. Practice makes perfect. So come along and let's find out some ways of really being strategic of how we monitor conversations on social media. So we're going to do two things. First, we're going to talk about how we at First Draft have found is the best way to approach monitoring. And then we'll go through some tips for different platforms. We're going to cover Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, a bit of TikTok and Reddit, and then some Google tools that you can use. So this is a jam-packed session. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. I will keep an eye on that throughout the session as well. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Laura Garcia. I am the Training and Support Manager at First Draft. You can find me at LauraGRB on Twitter, and my DMs are open for questions and or cat TikToks. So let's talk about how we approach monitoring, because social media networks change all the time. The tools that we can use to monitor them change all the time. But what doesn't change is how we should approach this kind of work. And there's two ways to go about it, basically. One is proactive monitoring, setting up networks and systems to systematically monitor conversations happening online. And the second one is reactive monitoring. So when there's a specific event that happens that then we need to react to find out what people are saying about these conversations. Now, reactive monitoring is important because whenever there's a big event that affects your newsroom or your team or your organization, it's important to know what conversations are being had online, right? It's like, think about it with an analog brain. If you were in a party and then everybody goes out to a different room, you need to get out to that different room to see what's going on, right? However, proactive monitoring is ever so powerful to help us unearth some of these conversations before they hit the mainstream or the public. And it's really important to think about the power of setting these with time and building them collaboratively with your team so that you are all looking together. Remember that the ideas and the keywords that you might think of, like we saw in our last session, might not be the same as another member of your team. And if you haven't watched our previous sessions, don't worry. We've got them all on our Vaccines Insights Hub, and you can catch up and go through a review of how to think about keywords and Boolean search queries. We'll do a little recap today anyway. So here's two examples of those two approaches. Right? The first one on the left is a screenshot of TweetDeck, which I'm going to show you how to use today, looking for specific keywords related to the vaccine. So if you can see here, it says vaccine and trials or vaccine and pharmaceuticals, AstraZeneca or Pfizer. And this is just constantly surfacing content that uses those words so you can keep track of how these conversations are evolving as they are happening. The second one is an example of how some of my colleagues in the editorial team did a bit of digging into what was being said on 4chan, which is a social media platform that I recommend you don't go into without thinking about it maybe 2 or 3 times, because there's some awful stuff on 4chan. But we wanted to find out as a team what conversations were happening on 4chan around Australia's Facebook news feud. So we put those keywords into 4chan to see what was happening, right? But the first one on the left is set up ahead of time, strategically trying to think about what are the issues that I am interested in knowing about, how people are talking about them online, what issues affect my work and my organization. And then the second one is reactive to something specific, that happens. And I just saw that comment in the chat. I will keep reading out these search terms, definitely. So that's the first thing. How do we approach this work, right? The second question is, which platforms are relevant to me and to the work that I'm doing? It's very easy to assume that the social networks that we use are the ones that everybody uses, right? I spend way more hours than I should on TikTok, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody does. And if you're thinking about it from a monitoring perspective, you need to know what the biggest party is to know what to listen into, right? And assumptions are never a good place to start. Always go and get some more stats. We refer to a website called Statista every once in a while when we want to get a sense of the most popular social networks globally, but also country by country. Because remember that information ecosystems are different depending on language, depending on culture, depending on different technical restrictions, and making sure that you don't make assumptions is really, really important. And it also tells you where you're going to look. The problem with monitoring is it can feel like you have to be listening to everything all the time. When if you think about it in a bit of a more strategic way, you can pick and choose where and when you look at different spaces. And that means that it becomes a bit of a more manageable job for you and your team. Most of us don't work in humongous teams that can do this all together. So that strategy piece is very, very important. So make sure you do a bit of homework of where are the communities that you want to reach to spending their time online? Where are these conversations happening? And then you can pick where to listen in on. And the second question is, how much time do I have? Again, not all of us are in big teams that can do this all together, but being strategic will help you be more effective in this monitoring search. And it all starts, like with many things, with a spreadsheet. Some of this work isn't particularly glamorous, but the more that you do it in a cyclical, iterative process, the more it builds. It snowballs. So for example, this is a screenshot of a Google Sheets that we use to just have a little think about what are the topics that we want to monitor. For example, you have a column for general things about the vaccine, the economic side of the vaccine, of how people talk about this kind of stuff, how it feeds into politics, how it relates to kind of lockdown liberty issues, things about conspiracy theories, and we build out these lists of keywords, right? And remember that keywords, ideology affects language. So how someone who is pro-vaccines talks about vaccines is going to be different to how someone who's maybe a bit skeptical of vaccines is going to talk about them. And then we also keep lists of sources, Facebook groups that we come across, Reddit boards that we come across, YouTube channels that we come across, because that means you've identified a source that if once there was either something newsworthy or that was disinformation, chances are it's going to crop up there again. And keeping lists of all of these is going to make your work easier. And it also is easier if you do it collaboratively. So if you're not the only one collecting this information. The third question we recommend you have a think about is, what devices am I using? We'll talk more about this in our next session about how to monitor closed spaces like Telegram or Signal. But it's important to remember that whenever you're going into any social platform online, you are participating in the information exchange required to be in that space. And that might mean, for example, here you have a difference between a public group on the right with 3,000 members versus a private Facebook group on, sorry, the other way around. I've got my left and right wrong. On the left, you have a public group with 3,000 members. And on the right, you have a private group with 900 members. Your exposure in each of these spaces is different, right? One is public, the other one's private, which means you need to apply to join. One has more people, so your presence is less noticed versus the other one where people are going to notice. And there's always security questions about, are you logging in through your computer? Are you using your personal account? Does that reveal more information about you than you feel comfortable with? Do you need to think about any questions they're going to ask you before you join a group and how you're going to answer them? Are you going to reveal your identity? We're going to go through some of this in a lot more detail next session as well, but we just wanted to put it out there because we're going to teach you how to dig into these spaces, but we always have to remember the ethics and security part of this work. Right. Let's get to some work. And let me open up the chat again because I think I accidentally closed it. Here we go. So platforms. Let's talk about Facebook. And when we say Facebook, we mean Facebook and Instagram because they're part of the same family, and the tools to monitor them are kind of blended together. The biggest one is called Crowdtangle. which is behind a paywall for the most part. But there's also a really powerful live display that Crowdtangle has created to monitor conversations around coronavirus all over the world. And I'll demo it in a second so you can see how it works. And what Crowdtangle lets you do in these public displays is to see by columns different either groups of Facebook pages or accounts and or keyword searches around coronavirus. And it lets you also filter them by level of engagement, timeliness, interaction, to just get a snapshot or a sense of the conversations happening around coronavirus. Now, it's important to mention that Crowdtangle is a tool built by Facebook to monitor Facebook. So that also needs to be taken with a little pinch of salt. This is the start of an investigation. We should never take anything we see on Crowdtangle as the gospel truth. It's always the beginning point of an investigation. And you can find all of these live displays at apps.crowdtangle.com /public hub COVID-19. And I'll show it to you in a second. The other way that you can monitor Facebook is by doing something called a site search. So this is by going to Google and typing site:facebook.com /groups, which is the sub URL for Facebook groups, and then adding whatever keywords you want to look for. Two things to remember. The S in site has to be lowercase, otherwise your site search is not going to work. And the other is that you can add also Boolean search queries here at the end to make your site search even more powerful. What is the difference between doing a site search for Facebook groups like this and typing it into your Facebook bar? For one, in Facebook, this algorithm is different because it's still trying to show you results that you are going to like. Remember that we use these social networks as information spaces when they're really not built like that. They're trying to be social spaces where we find things that ourselves and our friends can enjoy. So your first Facebook search query results are always going to be tailored to you and your activity on the platform. So that's one to keep in mind. The second one is that it's really fiddly. It's not that easy to do the search within Facebook native search bar because it's not a priority for them, right? That's not how they're expecting people to use Facebook. But if you do a site search, you are forcing Google to search through that specific URL of Facebook and find any groups that meet the criteria that you are specifying. So that means whether those words are in the title or whether they're in the description of the Facebook group. And this is going to be a really powerful way to find these spaces of conversation. Our research and monitoring team does this all the time to try and figure out these pockets of conversations happening online. And keep track of them, right? So if you found Facebook groups that are relevant to the work that you're doing, add them to your spreadsheet. Always think of this as a process that snowballs. Have a look at what words people are using to talk about the issue that you're researching on that Facebook group, and then add those keywords into your search queries, right? Add them to your spreadsheet, and it all feeds together. And that is the real power of proactive monitoring, is making sure that all of this informs each other, because then every single time you are at the same time casting a wider net, so listening to more conversations, but also doing it more strategically. And it means that you will find conversations that you weren't seeing before because you just weren't looking in the right place. So let's talk about Twitter. There are many tools to monitor Twitter, but the one that we use the most at First Draft is called TweetDeck. This is a free web browser-based application that all you need is a Twitter account to log on, make an account, and then be able to play around with it. There's 5 really cool properties that TweetDeck lets you do. The first one is that it accepts Boolean search queries. So you can type in or copy in a Boolean search query into TweetDeck. It lets you monitor trends, so things that are trending. And you can also filter top posts by engagement. You can display lists of accounts as columns using Twitter lists. And you can also search geographically. For the people who still have their location services on Twitter, you can then only say, for example, just show me tweets in Monterrey, Mexico, which is where I'm from, and in a 20-kilometer radius of that. And that is really powerful, particularly when you're trying to find eyewitness reports of something that's happening. Think about, for example, when there's big breaking news, if there's a big parade somewhere, there's going to be people who are at the parade talking about the parade, but also people who are not at the parade talking about the parade. And if you're looking for eyewitness accounts, you want the people who are there, and you can restrict that geographically. So let's do a little bit of demonstration. And this is where we're going to figure out whether, after a year of teaching online, do I know how to change my shared screen effectively. And hopefully you guys can see Crowdtangle. Can anybody give me just a little bit of a thumbs up or something in the chat to check that I've got the right display showing to you guys? Perfect. So let's go back a little bit to Crowdtangle. So this is the landing page for all of their coronavirus live displays. They make live displays available for other big international events, like they're going to make a couple for the elections coming up in Latin America. And the coronavirus ones are specifically useful because under coronavirus, you have a lot of other conversations happening around vaccines, around politics, equity and access to medication. All of those conversations are included in that. And you can see that they've created even like a global deck, one that looks for like nice stories around coronavirus. And then there's specific country dashboards. I pre-opened the Greece one because I think Greece looks really cool. And you can see that all of these different columns refer to different things. This is media outlets in Greece. Again, this is all made by Crowdtangle, so selected by them, right? On Facebook and Instagram. And then I'm not going to pretend like I can read Greek and tell you what the other ones are. But all of these other ones make sense to either search queries, or there's a column for politicians, there's a column for health NGOs in that country. And you can navigate them like this, left to right, just like you would, to give you a snapshot. Again, this is very much a cursory introductory look to the conversations happening online, so that then you can go in and dig in a little deeper. But if you look at this little like circle-y thing here, I can click on that and change the parameters of how I want it to display stories. So I can say, actually, don't show me the most recent ones. I only want to see the stuff that's overperforming. So it's getting shared more than normal, right? And I can also say, actually, not in the last 6 hours. I want to see in the last week to see what are the big conversations happening. And it filters it automatically, and it also gives you engagement metrics here at the bottom. This little like graph shows you the trend of how it started to get shared a lot, and then you have your normal metrics for comments and shares and likes. And you can even filter it down by language. For example, if you're covering a multilingual community in a country and you want to know exactly what people are saying in a particular diaspora, you can filter it all here. If your newsroom or your organization has access to Crowdtangle, you can also make these live displays, but that just takes a little bit more finagling. So let's talk about TweetDeck, and I'm mindful of time, so we're going to whiz through it. So TweetDeck has a lot of really cool features, like I said. One of the most important ones, at least for me and my work, is that it's web browser based. So wherever I am in the world, I can just go to tweetdeck.twitter.com and log on and see my specific TweetDeck. And you can see that it's laid out in columns. So you decide what each of these columns display. These are my notifications. This is, for example, a Twitter account that we have at First Draft. And I'm going to wait for it to reload because obviously technology had to refresh right when I was trying to show you something. Then this is a list of all of our editorial team that we've made at First Draft. This is a list made by someone else on good sources that tweet about verification. Then, for example, I have a list about women who work in this space. So if you want to diversify your voices and the sources that you're listening to, you can follow that list as well. And you can determine what these columns look like. TweetDeck immediately updates it with new content from either those accounts or the parameters that we're going to establish. So I've written here a little Boolean search query. And again, if you need a refresher on Booleans, go to our session 3. It's basically a way of using command operators to refine what you're looking for. This particular one is looking for tweets that include personal pronouns to talk about people's experience, my, I'm, our, and one of these phrases to talk about allergic reactions, bad reactions, severe allergy, or allergic reaction. This needs a quotation. And any of these words to talk about coronavirus. So you want one of the first, one of the second, one of the third. Gonna grab it, come over to TweetDeck. Again, if it decides to play. And then I'm gonna put it into the search bar. See how tiny this search bar is? We don't recommend you typing your Boolean search queries there because it's actually super, super fiddly. But you can type them out somewhere else and then copy them over. And I'm gonna copy over my search query and hit enter. And now what it's done, it's showing me content that only fits those categories that I've defined. You can even refine this more. So if you go to these little like toggly things, I can click on one and it's showing me what it's looking for. I can filter it by location. So I can say London, England, and a 20-kilometer radius. Immediately see how it filtered it? And again, it's only the people who have geo-tagging enabled on Twitter, but most of us forget to turn it off. So you get a lot of results. And then I can also filter by engagement. So I don't want to see what everybody is tweeting about vaccines. I want to see this stuff that's starting to get traction. So I'm going to say, just show me things with at least 25 retweets. And it's going to think about it a little bit. And then hopefully it's going to show us some results. Oh, maybe I put it too high. Let's try 10. That's a good thing, though, if there's not a lot of content trending around allergic reactions to vaccines. It does work, I promise. That example particularly doesn't, which is a good thing, because it means there aren't that many tweets of that nature right now floating around on the internet. But that is very, very powerful and a way to streamline what you're looking for. Another tool that I want to show you really quick is Google Trends. So Google Trends helps you track what are the words that we're all typing into our phones and our search bars because we're asking questions. And if you get to the first landing page, it immediately directs you to the US landing page, but you can change the country. So for example, here, come here to the top, I've switched it over to United Kingdom. I'm gonna look for the word vaccine. And it immediately kind of recommends me some things that I can look for. I'm just gonna do the search term. Like with Crowdtangle, this is a tool built by Google to monitor Google, so we need to all take it with a pinch of salt. But it's a cool little tool to figure out what questions people have and what conversations are happening online. So here, for example, we're looking for the UK for the past 12 months. I can filter this down by category, or even, for example, I can say, just show me YouTube stuff. And then I can compare it with, for example, the phrase the jab, because that's how British people call injections and vaccines, and to see how these conversations have happened over time, right? If you're a data nerd, you can download the data and play with the CSV. You can embed this into your stories if it informs something that you're talking about. If you scroll down, it also gives you really interesting data broken down by region. This is telling you any kind of big regional differences. And in this particular case, you don't have that many. And also gives you related queries, which is really important, but because it's showing you what are the other questions that people are asking around this topic. And sometimes that's where you'll find the surprising ones that maybe haven't made it into your feed because your friends aren't talking about it, but that other people are definitely having. And there's many, so you can like explore ad nauseum and find cool different things. And you can then click through for any of these. So for example, I can click through to have the jab, and then it'll open the dashboard specifically for that search query so I can keep doing some more comparisons. And you can see that there's a big spike here at the beginning of this year for that search query, have the jab. Remember the difference. This is questions people are typing into Google rather than tweets or posts that are being put out into the world. Last but not least, Google Alerts. You can use Boolean search queries or just search terms to send you email alerts of anything that gets published on the internet that fits your criteria. Beware, this can be very tedious if you don't limit the amount of emails you get a day. So for example, if I take this same Boolean query and put it into Google Alerts, I want to make sure to say show options and say at most once a day or once a week because otherwise it emails you every time it finds a new incidence of that. This is going to surface more website articles, blog posts, all that kind of stuff than social media posts, but it's an important tool that you can use as well. You can change the language or the region and refine it to really tune into the conversations that you're interested in listening in. I'm going to show you one last thing on slides, and then we are done because we're running out of time. So let me change over. Perfect. So we've done Google Trends. Other platforms. So you can use Boolean search queries on Reddit. That can also help you really strategically look for conversations in this particular space. TikTok does not have a native platform that or a dashboard that you can use to search for stories, but you can totally use a site search. So like we did with Facebook groups, site:tiktok.com plus your search queries, or just type the first keyword into your TikTok app and look at what are the suggested ways to finish that. And it'll give you an insight into the hashtags and the conversations that people are having on this space. So for example, look, 138 million views on coronavirus vaccine, 1.3 billion on vaccine, but you also have 10 million on vaccine side effects. These conversations are things we need to be aware of. And there's everything on TikTok: politics, cat videos, dance challenges, and also awful disinformation.